Hello, and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folktales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle. I'm sitting here the day after Crimbus. I am in Mexico. You might hear the laundry machine in the background. You might hear birds chirping. We're here for the journey. I do not celebrate Christmas, but I really wanted to talk about it because it's a global phenomenon, especially as someone who grew up in the United States. It's like, what's the word? It's a phenomenon. It's a sensation. I knew people who weren't religious. I wasn't religious growing up, but we celebrated Christmas. I had friends that were Jewish. Ooh, hello. I had friends that were Jewish who still had a Christmas tree and celebrated Christmas. And I've always wondered, how the fuck did this holiday, which from my understanding was about celebrating the birth of Jesus, turn into us giving gifts under the fake identity of a man named Santa Claus, who's this white man who wears red with reindeer? Like, where the fuck does all this shit come from? And why is it that it's so fucking popular, you know? I've really wondered, which is why we're gonna do a motherfucking deep dive into Christmas. I went pretty deep, so prepare yourselves, buckle up everyone. I could have gone deeper, but we would be here for 8 hours, so this is my best attempt of getting really fucking crazy in here. Before I start, I want to mention that I officially have a Patreon now. If you enjoy my podcast, if you like listening, please consider giving a monthly donation on Patreon. It's Patreon.com/esotericaandnonsense. The link is in the description. And I also now am selling merch. The link will also be in the description. Get yourself a sick Esoterica and Nonsense shirt. All of the proceeds will support the podcast. It helps me make more content. I really appreciate you. Let's get into it. I'm gonna have a sip of my tea. I'm drinking some black sticky rice pu'er. Yummy. Okay, let's talk about fucking Christmas, you guys. What the fuck does Christmas mean? I'll tell you what it means. Christmas literally means Christ's Mass. This is so funny to me. I'm fascinated with language. I'm fascinated with etymology. And as a kid, I always used to say Christmas because that's how it's spelled. And that's literally technically, like, you could argue this is how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's Christmas. So, interestingly, the word Christ is derivative of the Greek word Christos, which is a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, which in our language, English, literally means Messiah, or very specifically, the anointed. The chosen one, right? The anointed. So, of course, Christmas, is the day of celebration of the birth of Jesus, and specifically Mass, right? Mass being like Christian church session, right? A Mass usually has like a sermon, it has songs, it has the fucking, depending on what faith you are, sometimes there's communion, right? So like, that's really what Christmas is about. It's about celebrating a church service to celebrate the birth of Jesus. According to the Bible, in the book of Matthew, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is Palestine, to the Virgin Mary and to Joseph, a shepherd. And they traveled from Nazareth, which again is Palestine, now considered to be occupied Israel. And the story goes that they traveled from Nazareth, the north of Palestine, to Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank, because of a government decree. They were actually refugees, and they had to leave Nazareth as refugees to go to Bethlehem to look for safety. And in fact, Bethlehem, as refugees, they had nowhere to give birth, which is why they gave birth in a manger. Oh, there's a little Pepper barking. Little barking Pepper. Excuse me, sir, we're recording a podcast. I don't know whose Pepper that is, but he sounds cute, and I'd love to meet the Pepper. Okay, how interesting is it, and like oddly cyclical, that this prophet, arguably like the most famous prophet in the Western world, Jesus Christ, was a Palestinian refugee fleeing the north, which is now occupied today, to the West Bank, which is currently being bombed. And he was also born in a manger. He was born outside of a barn. And Peppers. I find this tragically ironic and fascinating that these things are repeating itself in time. And at this very moment, Palestinian people are being killed. And this man, Jesus, who seems to be worshipped all over the world, was in very similar conditions 2,000 plus years ago. So anyway, there's just a little thought for you. Okay, so one thing I want to address, Jesus. We use the word Jesus Christ, right? Christ meaning Messiah. So that wasn't really his name. This is like a later moniker we're giving him, Jesus the Messiah. But Jesus also is not really his name. Jesus is actually a Latin word. And this comes from the root of Jesus, or Jesus, which is a translation of the Hebrew word Yeshua. And Yeshua means Jehovah's salvation, or Jehovah is salvation. Basically, God is salvation. And so this child, who we know as Jesus, was really named Yeshua. I'm going to call him Yeshua now because I think it's just weird. I think it's just fucking weird to call him by the name of the empire that killed him. We all know the story that Jesus was eventually killed. That's not what Christmas is about. We'll have to do an Easter episode. But he was killed under the decree of the Roman Empire, and now we are calling him by his Roman name. I think it's pretty creepy and a little bit fucking weird. Okay, so let's backtrack. Yeshua is born to Mary and Joseph. Oh, and this is like a pretty crazy side tangent, but I really want to mention it because I was talking to a really interesting person who was raised really religious, and as they got older, they kind of branched out to different kind of communities of people who had studied scriptures. And there is some debate into the ambiguity of the Immaculate Conception. And in the scriptures, one could interpret the Immaculate Conception as Mary, meaning that Yeshua, Jesus, could actually have been conceived by Joseph and Mary, and that Mary herself could have actually been the Immaculate Conception, could have actually have been the baby born without a human father, the baby born by the grace of God. And I just want to throw that out there because this story written in the Bible does borrow from a lot of other ancient stories from around the world. And the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, which talk about Yeshua, Jesus, have been edited countless times throughout the first couple hundred years that we know of that they existed. What I'm really meaning to say is that there's elements of this story that are very possibly real and most likely real, and parts that have been added onto. And the idea that Joseph wasn't actually his father is possible, but a lot of ancient stories really did focus around the female character, the mother character, being the extension of God. So I just wanted to throw that out there, just an interesting thing to digest for you. So now Yeshua is born. He's born in Bethlehem, which is now currently the West Bank. The most common agreement of why his parents left as refugees was to avoid the wrath of the king of Nazareth. He was known as King Herod. And a nutshell of the legend goes that King Herod had heard a prophecy from 3 magi. We currently think of magi as wise men or as kings, but we're going to get into that into a second. But allegedly, these 3 quote-unquote wise men see a star rise into the sky. And the prophecy tells them the star, and because they study astrology, they are basically told by this star that a baby will be born in Bethlehem and that they should bring him gifts. And King Herod hears of this from these 3 magi. He tells them to go visit this baby and to report back to him. Right? Okay, so that's the beginning of the story. But let's talk about King Herod for a second. Because King Herod, it's a really interesting character. He was known as Herod the Great, and he was a Roman Jewish client king of Judea. What does that mean? Basically, he's like a subordinate king appointed by Rome. So he was alive between 72 BCE to about 4 CE, which means he only lived to around 32, which is a little bit crazy. Interestingly, at this point in time, right around the beginning of the millennia, majority of the Jewish census had emigrated to the Roman Empire and the greater territories, specifically between 27 BC and, I did my math wrong, you guys, because it's 72 BCE. Okay, got it. So he lived until he was 76. That makes so much more sense now. Oh my gosh, this BC shit, you guys. Okay, so as I was saying, a big majority of the Jewish census had emigrated to Rome, especially after the year 27 BCE, because there was starting to be Jewish kings appointed in the greater areas because of populations rising. So some historians believe that up to 7 million Jewish people were living in the greater Roman Empire. And of course, there was tensions between the Roman Empire and the people of the Jewish faith. It led to many conflicts, and one of these conflicts actually destroyed Jerusalem and the Second Temple. And so after this, it actually led to a tax on the Jewish people in the year 70, which was just 2 years after Herod was born. So basically what this tax was about is if you did not pay the tax, you were required to make a sacrifice to the Roman imperial cult. And really what that means is making an animal sacrifice to the emperor, because at this point the emperor of Rome was also a mandated religion in a sense. The emperors were seen as godly, and this is why I'm touching on this, because religion as we practice it today, it echoes a decree similar to the Roman Empire and also similar to the Islamic faith. The Abrahamic religions are very interesting because they seem to not only be religions, but to also be governments. And so as Herod became king, he grew up in an interesting climate in Rome. He grew up in a climate where Jewish people had gone through real conflicts. People had died. the temple had been destroyed in Jerusalem. But also their populations were growing, and eventually his father, Herod's father, had become good friends with Julius Caesar. So interestingly enough, Herod's family was not considered ethnically Jewish. His father and his mother were both Arab, and his father's ancestors had converted to Judaism. And so he grew up as someone who, at the time, was not necessarily identified as Jewish from his appearance, but who was raised culturally Jewish and raised with the advantage of being higher ranking in society. Both of his parents were descended of people who had either royalty or emperors in their blood. And his father had become friends with Julius Caesar, who was both emperor and general. So basically, fast forward, as Herod becomes older, he is in a very good position, and he and a couple of his brothers become client kings. They basically become subordinate emperors of the areas of Judea. And part of why Herod is known as Herod the Great is because a big part of his rule as king was about reconstruction, and he was very, very smart. He reconstructed the second temple in Jerusalem. As he was alive, he reconstructed the second temple of Jerusalem, but very smartly, he also built a temple of Augustus, and so this kind of kept him in a very advantageous place, because he was always showing his reverence for the Roman Empire. And so he was like playing his cards very strategically. He was rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, while also revering Augustus. So this is like kind of brilliant strategy here on the political stage at this time. And so Herod was very respected, especially by the Jewish people, right? He is a Jewish king, one of the first of his kind, and he's rebuilding and expanding the temple. Like, these are huge strides in their political power. Okay, so as I mentioned, these three magi, these three wise men, who are obviously respected by Herod, tell King Herod of this prophecy, of this baby that's to be born in Bethlehem. And they say that this baby will be, quote, King of the Jews. And so the legend, as it is assumed, Herod was very threatened by this, because Herod was, in fact, his moniker was King of the Jews. So it is said in the Bible, in the book of Matthew, that he ordered a massacre of the innocents after the birth of Jesus. So he basically ordered for all baby boys under the age of 2 in the area of Bethlehem to be killed. Historians today actually doubt this, but I did read an interesting article of a historian who mentioned that the population of Bethlehem at this time was very small, and that the number of boys under the age of 2 could have actually been a very, very small number. And if in fact King Herod did make this order, the historians at the time would have been employed by King Herod, and they may or may not have actually recorded this. Like, imagine if only 12 children were killed. And also, you know, if your historian is on your payroll, maybe you don't really want to add that to the history books that you ordered children to die. You know, like, I think we can all imagine that we'd want to keep that low on the PR list, right? So anyway, that's like an interesting thought that I read. Interestingly too, in this article, I read some really interesting points, because even though King Herod was beloved and considered a great king, he had a reputation for being incredibly brutal. And he was put on murder trial at one point in his life, and later he tried to murder the king, who had accused him, a different king had accused him of this murder, and later he tried to put a hit out on him, which obviously is sus. Also, allegedly, he had a wife and a son, which he named his son after his father, and eventually he fell in love with a new woman, and so he allegedly drove his first wife away and his first son so that he could marry this new woman. So like, this is not really a good look, obviously, and it wouldn't be hard to imagine a man of this reputation like calling for a hit out on children. But again, this is all speculative. We don't know this man, we don't know his heart. This is just how the story goes. So of course this man Herod is nervous about this prophecy. He orders this quote massacre of the innocents, and as I mentioned, before he ordered this hit, he tells the Magi to visit this baby and to report back to him. He says to the Magi, may you go forth and worship him. Okay, interesting. So he's telling the Magi that everything's cool. Go visit the baby, blah, 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 blah. And in fact, the Magi actually did go visit Jesus, right? We know the story. The three Magi travel through the night. They show up to the manger. They bring gifts of frankincense, gold, and myrrh. And interestingly, these were gifts at the time that people would give to kings. Frankincense was used for worship in the temple. Today, it is considered a symbol of Yeshua Christ, the high priest. And gold was a symbol of kingliness. And myrrh was a perfume that was used to anoint the dead bodies. So these three symbols now are kind of used for the three states of Christ. Christ as a holy figure, Christ as a king, and Christ as the resurrected. So it was a little interesting like Easter egg there. And interestingly, after the Magi visited this new baby, Yeshua, one of them had a dream that warned them not to report back to King Herod. So they didn't. And interestingly, Joseph also had a dream that King Herod wished to kill this new boy. So they in fact fled to Egypt as refugees to avoid this massacre of innocents. And there, baby Yeshua, Joseph, and Mary waited until after Herod died to move back to the area, and they eventually moved to Nazareth as it was not under the rule of Herod's son. So interestingly, I just wanted to mention this really fast. The book of Luke also has a recounting of this story, but I do want to talk about the difference between the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. The book of Luke was written after, and the book of Luke does have a lot more mention of the life of Yeshua as a prophet and the resurrection. However, it was written later and has been edited many times. So as far as the birth, I'm really kind of referring more to the book of Matthew, because I'm pretty skeptical of the Bible anyway, because of how many times it's been edited. It's hard to even say what could have been considered original and what isn't. Maybe we should all read the Dead Sea Scrolls. Stay tuned for an episode on that. But in the book of Luke, the massacre of innocents was not mentioned. And in the book of Luke, these three magi are actually usually referred to as wise men or kings. That's another reason why I don't really trust the book of Luke as much, because already this is a watering down of the story. Who are magi? What is magi? What the fuck does it mean? I'm so excited to talk about it. This is where shit gets fucking interesting, you guys. Magi is a fascinating word. So nowadays, because of the Bible and because of some of like the, dare I say, whitewashing of history, we have kind of been taught that magi refers to wise men or spiritual scholars or even kings. But actually, the word magi refers to priests of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is one of the most ancient religions on planet Earth. It is an early religion of ancient Western Iran. And the word magi specifically does refer to the priests of Zoroastrianism, but this is actually derivative of a Greek word for magos, which is synonymous for doer of magic. So basically this term magi became a word used for any practitioner of magic or practitioner of the Zoroastrian faith all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asia, until late antiquity and often after. So even the English word magic derives from the word magi, right? So maybe you're asking yourself, like, what the fuck is Zoroastrianism? You know, I actually had never heard of Zoroastrianism until the pandemic, when I literally just went on like a month-long Wikipedia spiral. That's how I had the idea to start this podcast, because I literally spent months of my time during the pandemic on Wikipedia taking handwritten notes of just fucking wild ass shit. And it's actually pretty crazy because Zoroastrianism is considered the first monotheistic religion, and it is considered the godfather, if you will, of all Abrahamic religions. And why the fuck had I never heard of it growing up? It seems kind of fucked up. It is believed that the prophet of Zoroastrianism, his name was Zoroaster, he is considered to be the inventor of astronomy and alchemy. So that's why this word magi eventually came to include anyone who studied astrology, alchemy, or any kind of esoteric studies. So that would make me a magi, and by you listening, that would make you a magi. So like let's like fucking get into it. Like what the fuck? Why the fuck haven't we heard of this? In my opinion, I mean I don't really have to like tell you twice, but I have a feeling that the areas surrounding Iran and Iraq and what we now call the Middle East, a lot of their ancient culture seems to be strategically erased by the Western powers. I remember growing up that like Baghdad was being bombed when I was a kid, and I remember like all these troops going into Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran. And I just remember, like, as a kid, all this propaganda of, like, Middle Easterners being terrorists, right? And as I got older and started doing research, I learned that Baghdad is Babylon. It's the same fucking city. I also learned that the Library of Alexandria, which was considered to be the most extensive ancient library in the history of the world, with scriptures from all over the world, a large portion of those scrolls were sent to Baghdad. And it was fucking leveled in the early 2000s, dude. Like, it's pretty fucking intense. So anyway, this is just like my conspiracy brain talking, but I personally, through the evidence of the more recent history, I have come to the conclusion that the Western powers want to erase a lot of the ancient history of what we now call the Middle East. So let's get deep into this. Zoroastrianism is also sometimes called Mazdayasna, or it is known as Bedin. And as I mentioned, Zoroastrianism is considered to be one of the oldest organized faiths in the world. This religion or faith became very popular and actually replaced the original Mesopotamian religion, which technically isn't fair to call a religion. The ancient Mesopotamians did not have a word for religion, and all of their cuneiform tablets referred to the Anunnaki, a race who came from the stars, who came from the heavens, and this was not a religion. This was considered to be history. So now modern historians call Zoroastrianism the predecessor, or no, it wouldn't be the predecessor. It would be the second religion, right? But technically that is incorrect because they did not consider their original beliefs to be a religion, but in fact history. I just wanted to throw that out. So this arguably could be considered the oldest religion on Earth. So this religion, this philosophy really are based off of the writings of the prophet Zoroaster, or sometimes known as Zarathustra. He was an Iranian poet, and it's debated when he was alive, but it's like loosely believed that he lived 5,000 years before the Trojan War, which is roughly 6,200 BCE. So that would make him about 8,000, living around 8,000 years ago. 8,200 years ago. That's a long fucking time. So interestingly, like, this religion or belief system is like pretty fascinating. It is considered one of the first monotheistic religions, but it's kind of a reductive statement, because you could also argue that Zoroastrianism is a philosophy. Really, like, the core beliefs of Zoroastrianism are based on the teachings of Zoroaster. And he really talked about the nature of being. And in the nature of existence, the nature of being, the nature of consciousness, there is a duality within all things, and a duality of God. So this is what we would call today, like, quote, good and evil. But really it's about this like lightness and darkness, or what you could consider order and chaos. So this philosophy predicts the ultimate conquest of evil by good. So really, like, the core beliefs were that they were like faces of God, if you will. But there was this benevolent deity that was known as Ahura Mazda, who is known as the Lord of Wisdom, aka the Supreme Being, the Creator. And then there was an opposing destructive spirit known as Angra Mainyu. And, this is, I guess, like the bad boy counterpart, the destroyer. And basically these two forces are at a constant war with each other. A major core belief of this philosophy is that a living being must have the active and ethical participation in their life. And through good deeds, one could form good thoughts and good words. And these were imperative to ensure happiness and to keep chaos at bay. And to actively participate in one's life is a key piece of exercising free will. And this is considered to be the first religion to employ the idea of messianism and the belief of free will, the belief of judgment after death, heaven and hell, angels, demons, everything. So this is like really laying the groundwork for all Abrahamic religions. Think about this. Like, this is all kind of like key pieces. What I really love about this, and a core part of the teachings, is about exercising your mind to be in the driver's seat of your soul. So like a really big part of the teachings is to think good thoughts. And really, by good thoughts, they are pure thoughts, thoughts of kindness, thoughts of positivity. And through good thoughts, you could speak good words. And through good words, you could do good deeds. And this is about exercising your free will as an individual. Because as I mentioned earlier, this like primordial battle between quote unquote good and evil is the purpose of humanity. Each individual is actually living out this primordial fight between good and evil, and it is every individual's job to use free will to prevail over chaos. I mean, honestly, I can kind of get down with this. I don't really use good and evil anymore because I feel like those are really loaded terms, but I can definitely get down with exercising focus and free will to prevail over an internal chaos that could theoretically act out of like bitterness and hate. Pretty interesting. Another like core belief of Zoroastrianism that I find really interesting is like a guiding force in the life of a human would be its fravashi. A fravashi is basically a higher spirit. So like when you're born as human, you inherit a body, but you are a spirit, but you also have a higher spirit, which is essentially a slice of Ahura Mazda, a slice of the supreme being, the creator of the universe, who has existed since the beginning of time. And this fravashi, this higher spirit, acts as a source of energy and a source of inspiration for a person to perform good actions and to act as a spiritual protector of an individual. Pretty fucking crazy, you guys. Pretty fucking nuts. And this religion was actually popular in Iran and the ancient world for over 1,000 years. This religion was massive between the year 6000 BCE and 650 CE. So that's over a millennia, okay? Get with it. A big reason why it declined was through the conquest of the Arab Muslim empires and the persecution of the Zoroastrian people. Okay, I just want to mention right here, right now, that Islam and Christianity have huge similarities, and they're both Abrahamic faiths. They both worship a prophet above all, and both of them have used and infused a religion with government. And I find it really interesting, and just reflecting on my childhood, that I grew up, in the United States, in California, which is considered to be like open-minded and liberal, but I grew up with a lot of propaganda that was Islamophobic and pretty openly racist towards the people of the Middle East. And I think there's like this preconception that they are seen as like totalitarian in their religious and political beliefs. But what's so interesting is that throughout history, I see Christians doing the same shit. I think Islam and Christianity both speak of kindness to people, forgiveness of people, and really having a relationship with God, with Allah, having a relationship that is really just between you and the creator of the universe. And by focusing on that relationship and being kind, you basically are set free, right? And yet both censuses, both populations have inflicted incredible traumas and crimes against humanity. And I just wanted to bring that up because Zoroastrianism seems like a beautiful religion, and sadly through the Arab Muslim conquest, it is now kind of like but a story. There are some people who still practice Zoroastrianism, and they're usually actually the biggest population of Zoroastrians are now in India. But I just really wanted to like touch on that for a second, that like I think Christianity and Islam are academically considered siblings, but I also think that they have so much more in common than they would care to admit. And I think that there's some like work that needs to be done, because the scriptures are pretty clear about what it means to be a kind person and a messenger of God or Allah. So anyway, just wanted to throw that up there. Okay. So I actually should and will do a full episode on Zoroastrianism. I actually started notes on this last year, but I got it got just like overwhelmed. There's so much information, and I'm self-diagnosed as ADD, so I just kind of like moved on. But I promise I will do a full episode on Zoroastrianism because there's so much more to talk about. But I do really want to mention the legacy of Zoroastrianism on the modern world. A big legacy that they left are obviously the core beliefs that I mentioned, like this like primordial like good and evil, fight against good and evil. Like this is very similar to the Bible, where there's only one God, except there's also like this devil character or Lucifer character. Like it's just really interesting that there's like only one, except there's other characters, right? But also like simple things like even nun habits that nuns still wear today all over Europe actually come from Zoroastrianism, and this is what magi and people of clergy were wearing. So just saying. But a big reason why I wanted to do this deep dive was because at the time of Jesus's birth, which was roughly around the year 0, there's debate about the exact year, but at the time of Jesus's birth, Zoroastrianism was in its height. And I mentioned that it wasn't really just a religion, it was also a philosophy, and it was also a very scholarly pursuit. These Zoroastrian priests or magi were very well educated in astrology, astronomy, and all kinds of shit. So throughout the ancient world, they were very highly revered as scholars and as viziers, basically, to high-ranking officials. So it's just so interesting to me that at the time that baby Jesus, baby Yeshua was born, that 3 Zoroastrian priests showed up to give him gifts and treat him like a king. This is just like super pivotal, and it's just so interesting because Zoroastrianism is considered a parent of Christianity, and in the actual scriptures there are priests present at the birth of the Messiah. So pretty fucking nuts, you guys, pretty fucking nuts. But as I mentioned, as time went on, and in the book of Luke, and through the Anglification and Europification of the Bible, magi stopped being used, and it was very common in Europe for them to say wise men or kings, right? And so like fast forward throughout history, you know, there's 3 kings cakes, there's fucking carols about the 3 kings, there's fucking plays about the 3 kings, and this is like all kind of like a bastardization of a very like esoteric title. Okay. So that's like some detail into the actual story, right? Like this is the story of baby Jesus. But how the fuck did this story end up becoming a tale about a fat man in red hopping down our chimneys at night, giving us presents or coal, and eating our cookies? Like where the fuck, like how the fuck does this happen? Do you know what I mean? Like why are we decorating trees now and saying ho 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 Merry Christmas? You know, like what the fuck? So like let's get into it. So first of all, fun fact, some historians seem to think that Jesus, Yeshua, was actually most likely born during the springtime. Boom, bitch. So why hold the Mass of Christ on fucking December 25th? Why? Well, interestingly enough, in the 2nd century, these are when we have the earliest church records that indicate a Christmas, a Mass of Christ. And these were simply church celebrations, or masses really, where they were celebrating the birth of the Lord. These sprang up organically, obviously. If you haven't listened to the Coptic episode, highly recommend you listen. At this time, Christianity was really just kind of getting going. It was very chill. It was very philanthropic. These were schools, these were churches. They were very simple, reading the scriptures, you know, revering Christ. We love it. So at this time, these were just kind of like organic masses for Jesus. However, at this time, that this is still the 2nd century. This is way before Rome made it its official religion, and at this point, there wasn't really like a huge consensus on how to practice. The biggest church was obviously in Egypt, but people were practicing in different parts of the East, in parts of modern-day Turkey, modern-day Armenia. So there was like, everyone was kind of doing their own thing, and they had never agreed on an exact date. And it really wasn't actually until the end of the 4th century that December 25th would become the day to celebrate the birth of Christ. A big reason why they chose this day is because a huge number of Christians were living in the Roman Empire, and the December 25th was originally the winter solstice, and winter solstice was a pretty lit holiday. They called it Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, which was the birth of the invincible sun. So just think about this. The solstice in Rome is considered a birthday of the sun. You're celebrating the birth of the sun. So that became a very easy way to superimpose the birth of the Lord, the birth of Yeshua, onto the exact same day. See what they did there? And rewind deeper into the Roman lore and into the lore of that whole area was the festival of Saturnalia. And Saturnalia was considered to be like one of the biggest Roman holidays of all time. And this was happening in the same time of year. It could have been happening on the 25th or within the lunar cycle around that time, or the solar cycle. I'm pretty sure solar cycle, because the Romans used solar cycle and the Egyptians and the Eastern peoples used lunar cycles. But long story short, the reason why it was the quote unquote birth of the sun god is because Saturnalia was originally this like massive fucking festival. Saturnalia was all about celebrating the god Saturn. It was believed that the god Saturn had once ruled over humanity and had ruled over the world in, quote, the golden age. And originally, Saturnalia was celebrated on December 17th, and then later it expanded to be like a whole long festival all the way through the 23rd. And they would basically like make sacrifices in the temple of Saturn. They would make sacrifices in the Roman Forum to the emperor. See what they're doing here? They would have public banquets, feasting, private gift giving. And the gift giving was like kind of more trinkety. They would usually give like silly gifts, humorous gifts. They would often give wax figures of deities to each other. And Saturn was really seen as an agricultural deity. And I mentioned like he was thought to have ruled over humanity during the Golden Age. So this festival of Saturn was really seen as a time to like celebrate abundance and celebrate the world when it was once in a state of innocence. So they would celebrate Saturn, make those sacrifices. Afterwards, they would fucking party. They'd have carnivals. Gambling was illegal. Gambling was legal during this time. Usually gambling was illegal, but during Saturnalia, people were allowed to gamble. And get this, masters would actually provide table service for their slaves, because this was seen as a time of liberty and freedom for both free people and enslaved people. That's fucking cool. Another big part of Saturnalia was fucking. People were having a lot of sex. This was a kind of about like, quote, celebrating the state of innocence of the world, but this was really about liberty. It was about freedom. It was about fucking getting wasted and fucking. And so like, as I'm sure we all know, sexual practices in Rome this was like pre-Christian era. So there was a lot of men having sex with other men having sex with their mentors and their apprentices. There was like orgies happening. Like this was a pretty fucking wild time. So this was kind of like the favorite time of year for a lot of Romans, and this became like an easy way to just tack on the birth of Christ, But meanwhile, in other parts of the Christian world, we have the East, we have like the areas of Turkey, Armenia, and Egypt, and a lot of other Eastern places. They had like a different thing going with Christmas. A big thing that they celebrated was the Epiphany, and the Epiphany is considered to be the day that Jesus was baptized. Also, they're following different calendars. In Rome, they're following the Gregorian calendar, which is sun-based, and then in Egypt, they were following the Julian calendar, which is lunar-based. So in the Eastern traditions, they usually celebrate Christmas on January 6th or January 7th. And so interestingly, to this day in Egypt, they celebrate Christmas on January 7th. Fun fact. Okay, so as time goes on, like I mentioned, the end of the 4th century, so this is the late 300s, like this is when Christmas is kind of becoming a little bit more routine, like it's starting to become a little bit more globally standardized. So Constantinople became the first city to have a giant Christmas feast in the year 379, and Jerusalem followed suit. And about 200 years later, this became like a yearly thing in Jerusalem, where you'd have this like massive feast. And I do want to mention that they were not using the word sacrifice, right? Christians never use the word sacrifice. They use the word feast. But what I really want to talk about is in the ancient world, when people would say sacrifice, they were often slaughtering animals in a sacred place, but then they were eating it. That's part of the sacrifice. So I do really kind of want to talk about like the marketing, like the PR around just like word choices, the difference between feast and sacrifice. Obviously there's like intention there, but I think a big part of it is how you intention the kill, right? And I think that we associate sacrifice with savagery, but I really do think that the idea of taking the life of an animal that you're about to eat with the intention of respecting a god and seeing that animal as sacred, and that animal is a gift to the god, could actually be more humane than just killing an animal for you to eat. I just want to throw that out there because I think nowadays there is less reverence for like taking the life of an animal, and I just do think it's just really interesting framework and like arguably like Christian rhetoric to like see sacrifices as a barbaric. Okay, just throwing that out there. Okay, so now we're like moving into we're moving into the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the Mass and the feast became like the biggest part of the celebration. They'd have the Mass, they'd go to church, sing all the songs, and then there would be a huge fucking feast. And at this point too, interestingly, Europeans were focusing mostly on the Epiphany, which was mostly focusing on the visit of the Magi and the baptism of Christ, and less about the specific birth. And during this time, the early Middle Ages, this is when festivities were becoming super elaborate. So this is when like local parts of Europe were combining their pre-existing holidays with Christmas. So this is where we get like more variation in Christmas gatherings, because Christianity was really spreading all over Europe. So a really big thing that was going on in medieval Europe was this whole like Saint Martin situation. I don't know if you've heard of it. I had never heard of it. I had heard of Saint Martin, the underground city. We should talk about that on a different episode. But there is a 40-day ritual similar to Lent, where basically 40 days before Christmas you would fast. And you would have the Feast of St. Martin on November 11th. You would then fast, and then you would have Christmas after. And interestingly, this was known as the Advent. The Feast of St. Martin was known as the Advent. And interestingly, I'm pretty sure in Egypt today they still fast before Christmas. So it wasn't until the 12th century, so that's the 1100s, that Christmas became a 12-day festival. And this was often celebrated between December 25th and January 5th, or between December 21st and January 1st. And what's so interesting about this is something that we don't talk about enough, is that a really big reason why this was a 12-day festival was because the Christian clergy could not decide on what day to fucking celebrate Christmas, right? In the East, they were celebrating everything on January 6th. In the West, everyone's celebrating December 25th. And some cultures were still celebrating their pagan holiday of the solstice. So what they decided, this actually was a real summit. This happened in 567. Christian clergy got together and they decided to make Christmas, quote unquote, Christmastide, which is Christmas time. And they decided to make it a 12-day holy festival so that it could encompass all the different days that people were celebrating Christmas. And that, therefore, we've been doing this all along. It was always supposed to be 12 days, right? But it's pretty interesting. And so after this is kind of when Christmas really started becoming more of an imperial holiday. This is now changing from just being a religion to being incorporated with government. We have emperors and kings being crowned on Christmas Day. Christmas is just growing, and Charlemagne actually had a really big part to do in that. Charlemagne was making Christmas a mandated holiday, and that's why you see after Charlemagne multiple kings and emperors choosing to be crowned on Christmas Day. Think about that. The birth of the prophet, the beginning of a new king. This is all very strategically done calendar scheduling. So interestingly, in the north of Europe, we have Scandinavia and the Germanic areas. They obviously already had winter festivals. Winter is not a joke there. And some of their biggest holidays were being celebrated during the winter and during the darkest points of winter, which we would call the solstice. These would happen between December and January, and sometimes all the way up to February, depending on the lunar cycle. And this time, we would refer to as Yule. It went by many names depending on the country that you were in, but loosely, we would call it Yule time. And Yule festivities vary depending on country, right? We have so many countries in the north. We have the greater areas of Germany. We have Sweden, Norway, Finland. We have Iceland. There are so many areas in the north that had quote Yule time and solstice festivals, and there was a whole bunch of shit going on. But a lot of these revolved around full moons between late December and early February. And a big theme in the Yule celebration revolved around the Great Hunt. The Great Hunt is a mythic hunt, usually about Odin. And I honestly could do a whole episode on the Great Hunt, but the Great Hunt is kind of this mythic battle, this hunt of the gods, if you will. And it was celebrated at this time because really the winter is about celebrating the abundance of the new year, calling in a great hunt, right? But another interesting part of the Yule time was celebrating the Modreinheit, or the Modranicht, which is the Night of Mothers, Mother's Night. Interesting, because the Great Hunt, we have this quote masculine warrior-like aspect to the celebration, but then we have this maternal, feminine, passive part of the celebration. And I actually had never known that. And interestingly, we could talk about this for days, but another big thing that Christianity has seemingly erased is the divinity of femininity. That's why earlier I brought up the Immaculate Conception being Mary, because I had never heard that growing up. I don't think any person in the Christian church would ever talk about that. And it's interesting to hear that some of these festivals that predate Christmas, these solstice festivals, involved honoring mothers. So interestingly, this Mother's Night, not a lot is known about it, which is not surprising. Obviously, a lot of these cultures were using oral traditions, and also like Christianity fucking destroyed so much shit of Europe and quote unquote like pagan and heathen religions. But it is said and rumored that some of the celebrations of Mother's Night was having women going to altars and temples in groups of 3 and being worshipped and revered as goddesses. And this is very reminiscent of Isis and Hecate, the triple goddess, the idea of like the triple energy being associated with woman, with femininity, and with divinity. And interestingly, like we talked about in the tarot, the 3 is designated for the Empress. It is the triangle, the shape of change, and a femininity. And I just thought that was interesting. But another big aspect of these Yule festivals were animal sacrifices. A big thing that they would do was take animals, livestock, horses, to their temples, their places of worship, and they would use the sacrificial blood to soak. They would basically make like ornaments. They were like spiky twig ornaments, and they would soak them in the sacrificial blood and use them to sprinkle blood all over the inside of the temple, the outside of the temple, and over the men who were present for the ceremony. And this would basically be to bless things with abundance, with the juice of life. And then they would eat a feast after. They would eat all the meat of the sacrificial animals. And I just think this is so interesting because these people who we would now consider pagan were considered heathens by the Christians. And it's so funny to me because it's so clear that these rituals are still being done. They just aren't sprinkling themselves in blood, but you're still murdering animals and eating them. Like, it's so funny just to see how similar they are, and yet they were condemned. So actually in Scandinavia, the political landscape at this time was so super interesting because Christianity was spreading, and a lot of rulers of surrounding areas would appoint kings, Christian kings, secretly. So at this time in Scandinavia, kings started to be appointed who were secretly Christian, and they would actually keep this a secret. But they would do little things like moving Yule celebrations on Christmas Day. So whereas before Yule may have been on a full moon close to the solstice, now this king is moving Yule to Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. And they would even fine people and tax people if they didn't participate. And these kings would refer to their people as fucking heathens. Like this is some real shit, you guys. Another really big part of their Yule celebration was to drink alcohol. They would drink ale. They'd make toasts to Odin for victory and power to be king. And they would toast to Njoror and Freyr, who were goddesses, and they would toast for good harvest and for peace. And then they would toast to the dead townsfolk, the people that they had lost. How interesting is this? I mean, this kind of does remind me of the Holy Ghost, this whatever, like, you know, I just mentioned earlier that the frankincense, the gold, and the myrrh were appointed to the priestliness of Jesus, the kingliness of Jesus, and the resurrected. And it's just interesting to hear in this Yule toast that they toast to Odin, the king. They toast to the goddesses for harvest and for peace, right? You could call that priestliness. And then they toast to the people who have fallen. So it seems that Christianity has borrowed from and absorbed all of these pre-existing rituals slowly over time, because all of these political leaders who were being appointed were Christian, at first secretly Christian and then openly Christian. These pagan rituals began to be banned, and they were slowly replaced with Christian activities, rebranded, reframed, etc. But of course these traces remain. We can see them. Like a big part too would be the feast and the drinking, especially in England, but in other parts of Europe. A big part of Christmas celebration is to drink and be merry. That does come from Sweden. The other thing, or Scandinavia, I should say. Sometimes my brain defaults to Sweden because I am Swedish. My mom is, or I shouldn't say that I'm like Swedish. I have Swedish blood, and I was raised with like some Swedish culture, barely. But my mom is half Swedish, and my mom, as a kid, actually, when we would celebrate Christmas, she would have a separate Christmas tree. We'd have 2 Christmas trees. We'd have one Christmas tree with like all the regular ornaments, and then we'd have a Christmas tree with Swedish ornaments, and they were all made out of like hay or corn husks. No, they weren't made out of corn husks. They were made out of like wicker. Like they were made out of like straw. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because reading earlier that the rituals of Yule were to soak these like twig ornaments in blood and use them to flick blood everywhere fascinated me, because I wonder, I don't know, like I wonder if some of the ornaments that I grew up looking at could have also been used for similar things. It's pretty metal and really interesting. So yeah, that's just like a stupid little tidbit, but this is actually where I want to talk about the Christmas tree. This is like a perfect segue. So the Christmas tree is an interesting origin story, and the Christmas tree is believed to have started in Germanic and Baltic regions, and possibly also Scandinavia. And originally it was thought that people would decorate a tree in the center of town with papers and decorations that would resemble fruits and flowers. And it is possible that originally this practice was about revering this tree as a Yggdrasil, or the tree of life, who goes by many names. And they would put candles on the tree, they'd put lights on the tree, and eventually, as Christianity became more common, it is thought that as they decorated the tree, they would put like fake apples, so that this tree would become the tree of knowledge from the Bible. And then eventually, as time went on, people started doing this in their homes. So instead of doing this in the center of town with a living tree, they would cut down trees and decorate them in their home. And also, another fun fact is that this Yule tradition and this Germanic tradition also is thought to be the godfather of the Santa myth. So during the Yule tradition, I mentioned a really big part of worship was around Odin, who was often called Wodan or Jolnir. Jolnir means Yule figure, or sometimes he was called Langborar, which means long beard. And he was depicted as an older man with a long white beard. He rode a gray horse known as Sleipnir, and this horse would fly through the night. And it was said that Sleipnir had 8 legs. What the fuck? He would wear blue hooded cloaks. He'd fly through the midwinter sky. He would visit people with gifts. And some stories mention him even entering homes through chimneys or fire openings. Also, there was a Yule goat, which was a big part of the gift giving. Some people would give each other like blessed goats, like to sacrifice, and it would be a gift of abundance for the next year and something to feast on. And that sparked something in my mind, because that could be where the idea of Krampus comes from, because Krampus and these like darker Christmas characters often have these goat horns. And I think it's just really interesting and important to mention that almost every ancient religion features goat sacrifice or goat worship because they were, the livestock of the old world. And it seems that because Christianity feared paganism and demonized paganism, that now we associate goats with the devil. And I think that is not a coincidence. I just think it's so funny that like these people of Scandinavia were seen as heathens, and it just seems that like modern Christmas now is just like all borrowed shit from them. So like we're basically practicing a heathen Christmas in the words of the Christians. So basically, as the Middle Ages continue, Europe and Scandinavia begets more and more elaborate Christmas. Feasts become bigger and bigger. People are drinking more and more. Allegedly, King Richard II hosted a Christmas feast in 1377, and he was said to have 28 oxen and 300 sheep at his feast. That's a lot of fucking animals to eat. And then eventually a Yule boar became a big part of Christmas. The Christmas pig, of course. These are all obviously like inspired by Scandinavia, calling something a Yule animal. There's the Yule goat, now there's a Yule boar. This is all very reminiscent. And around this time in the Middle Ages, when British kings were having huge Christmas feasts, this is when caroling got really popular. And it is thought that caroling is actually borrowed from the Saturnalia feasts and traditions, as well as the Yule traditions, because in both Saturnalia and the Yule tradition, singing and dancing was a really big part of it. So at this time in the Middle Ages, when caroling became popular, there were actually really like dance troupes that would do like song and dance performances for the king. And this became like a really big part of Christmas. And this is my favorite part. Another really big part of Christmas was a thing called misrule. And misrule was basically where drunkenness, promiscuity, and gambling were allowed and encouraged. And again, this is very reminiscent of Saturnalia, right? This is where people could be free, they could imbibe, they could have sex. Like, this is all very fucking Roman, dude. Like, it's just crazy how we're just like repeating shit and pretending like it's civilized, even though this is fucking heathenry, dude. So now we're coming up on the 13th century, and this is when nativity plays get really into fucking fashion. People are like dressing up as Mary, they're dressing up as Jesus, they have a fucking baby, or they're even making statues, like doing idols. The nativity becomes like super in vogue. All the while, people are getting fucking wasted. And like at this point in the 1300s or the 13th century, England is like drinking ale specifically. Like, ale becomes a big part of Christmas, which again, this is fucking Yule, dude. And around this time, that's when people start getting into exchanging gifts. And actually, usually during this time in the Middle Ages, people were giving gifts on New Year's Day. And most gifts were given in professional settings. So people were giving gifts to their landlords, giving gifts to their bosses, or vice versa. And Reformationists and Protestants in the 16th and 17th century changed the gift bridge to the 25th. So basically what they were saying is that we should give gifts to children on the 25th because that was the day that Christ himself was born. So let's honor the children. So, I mean, who knew? The Protestants and the Reformationists are the one to thank for that. So moving onwards, like into the 17th century, Puritans were like pissed the fuck off. Puritans were not feeling Christianity. They saw it as Catholic. They saw it as blasphemous. They thought it had nothing to do with the scriptures. And in their defense, it doesn't. The scriptures talk nothing about celebrating Christmas and getting drunk and like fucking partying. So like not that I'm like pro-Puritan, but like if you are gonna follow the scriptures, like maybe you should, I don't know. So the Christians, that was a Freudian slip. The Puritans banned Christmas in 1647 after the English Civil War. The Puritans were over it. They were done. It was bullshit for them. And in England, this actually caused riots for years. And people would illegally decorate the streets with holly, and they would play football on Sunday. Apparently, like, soccer on Sunday was prohibited, because Sunday, of course, is the day of rest. So people were like playing soccer in the streets on Sundays. They were fucking decorating the streets. Like, this was all against the law. And this lasted for 13 years. People were like, really didn't give a fuck. They were like, we're gonna celebrate Christmas. That would be a good Christmas movie. I'm sorry. We need to make a Christmas movie in fucking medieval Europe where the Puritans ban Christmas, and everyone's like, we're gonna get wasted and play soccer anyway because I love Christmas. I'm gonna get wasted and play soccer in the name of Christmas. There's a Christmas movie for you. Sign me up. Get me a deal with Netflix. So around this time, so now we're like into the 1600s, 1700s, right? So at this point, the United States is on the global stage. And in the United States, interestingly, Christmas had an interesting reputation because a lot of the pilgrims who came to the States were fucking Puritan, remember? So they were like, fuck Christmas. We don't fuck with Christmas. Christmas is for fucking heathens. However, there was a lot of like working class Englanders who were being sent over to the US either because they were looking for a new life or they were fucking prisoners. And a lot of these like working class Englanders love Christmas, you know? Christmas was like a time to get wasted and like eat a fucking roasted pig or whatever. So they obviously wanted to celebrate. But there was like a lot of like conflicting agendas. So in Boston, they actually made it illegal to celebrate Christmas in 1659. And it wasn't until 1681 that they legalized it again. But it didn't become popular until the mid-19th century. And we'll get into why. But basically, like, throughout the beginning of the U.S., Christmas was kind of this, like, iffy thing because, again, after the American Revolution, it became very unpopular to celebrate Christmas because it was seen as a British holiday. And so at that point, people from the U.S. were like, fuck Britain, we're our own people. And so during this time after the American Revolution, Christmas was much more popular in Germany and England. And interestingly, meanwhile, it was also losing popularity in France because France had the French Revolution around the same time period. And they had also seen Christmas as an extravagant holiday of the ruling class. So they like banned Christmas services, and they even renamed a popular Christmas cake known as the Three Kings cake, or really it should be called the Three Magi cake. But during this time, they renamed the Three Kings cake to Equality cake, which makes me fucking laugh. Like, you can't write this shit because this is reminiscent of in the early 2000s when like the US and France weren't allies anymore, and George W. Bush like renamed French fries Freedom Fries, and he renamed French toast Friendship Toast. Do you remember that? This is serving equality cake. This is like the same shit. I'm telling you, like, all of these like global tiffs and arguments, like, everyone is basically just twins looking in a mirror. We always hate what we are most like, you know? But whatever. Okay, so now we're like moving on through time. We're getting into the 19th century. This is when like Santa Claus / Father Christmas becomes like a huge part of the Christmas zeitgeist. So this is when Washington Irving and, of course, ding ding ding, Charles Dickinson are like writing about fucking Christmas. And specifically Charles Dickens. Did I say Dickinson? Charles, son of Dick. No, okay, so Charles Dickens is like writing, of course, if you don't know, Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. And a big part of both Washington Irving and Charles Dickens' writing was tying the idea of Christmas with charity for the poor. And Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843, and this became a pivotal piece in reviving, quote, the spirit of Christmas. And Dickens intentionally wrote A Christmas Carol with linking worshiping and feasting with the context of charity, goodwill, and social reconciliation, which honestly, like, I can't even be mad at. So like, right, because at this point, if you remember, like especially in England, but some other parts of Europe, Christmas was mostly like going to mass and then just getting wasted and eating a bunch of meat, you know, like that was kind of it. And so Dickens like really like kind of changed the social perception of Christmas, and he really, through A Christmas Carol, made Christmas about family gatherings, seasonal foods, generosity, giving, and, you know, like jolliness, or really like good deeds. And so this is also where we get the classic phrase, Merry Christmas. We all say Merry Christmas now, and this all comes from motherfucking Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. Shout out to A Muppet's Christmas Carol, one of the best Christmas movies ever made. So now moving on, like we're in like the 19th century, 1843 rolls around, we have the first commercially produced Christmas card. And this is also the time too where like Britain caught on to the Christmas tree. Before this time, Christmas trees weren't big outside of Germany and the Baltic regions. However, Queen Charlotte of England was born in Germany. Her daughter was Queen Victoria. So she raised her kids with Christmas trees because she thought, you know, that was a part of her childhood. She loved them. And so as Queen Victoria got older, and eventually a drawing was published of the royal Christmas tree, people around Europe and even in the US saw this published, and they wanted to get involved. They thought it was cool, they thought it was pretty. And so people started like putting Christmas trees in their house because of fucking royal, you know, everyone always fucking loves the royals. Like, think about it. I'm just saying, copying the royals is nothing new. And all you people who cut down trees to put in your house, just think about it. You're kind of clout chasers. Just saying. I'm not against the idea of decorating a tree, but maybe you could decorate a living tree. Maybe you could plant a tree on Christmas. Maybe you don't have to cut a tree down. I feel like that's kind of heathenry. Maybe we should relabel what is fucking considered heathenry, because we literally could use more trees in this world, and we shouldn't be cutting trees motherfucking down. Okay, so anyway, moving on. Christmas trees are getting popular. A Christmas Carol comes out. Like, Christmas is like really gaining momentum in Europe and in the US. And this is also the time when Santa Claus is entering the main stage. He wasn't really that popular in the Christmas celebration. And I mentioned before that like Odin was really more of this gift-giving character. But we also have Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas wasn't really had anything to do with Christmas originally. This was a real saint. He had lived in Myra, which now is considered Greece. He was a very ancient saint. This was in the 4th century. Okay, so we're going way back. And at this point in time, this part of Greece was part of the Roman Empire in what is today Turkey. So technically he's like in modern day Turkey, but at this time it was considered like a Greek portion of the Roman Empire. And Nicholas, who was a bishop, was famous for his generosity, and allegedly he gifted 3 impoverished sisters with dowries so that they would not have to become prostitutes. And it says in the legend that he threw coins through their window for them to make their dowries and to avoid the life of prostitution. And he allegedly traveled all throughout Europe. He became kind of famous, and as he died, some Italian looters, some pirates, dug his bones up and brought half of his bones to a different part of Italy. And eventually the rest of his bones were brought to Italy as well, but this kind of added to his lore and to his fame, like this whole like controversy around his bones. And he eventually became the patron saint of archers, sailors, pawnbrokers, children, and the city of Amsterdam and Moscow. So Saint Nicholas is basically seen as like a gifting saint, right? And because he was the patron saint of Amsterdam, he was a really big saint in the Netherlands. And so this is kind of how we get the whole like Saint Nicholas lore tied in with like gift giving and Christmas. So in the Netherlands, they would call Saint Nicholas Sinterklaas, which is based on Saint Nick. And they use the classic depiction of an elderly man with white hair, a long beard, which is very Odin, right? But he would wear bishop's robe and the little bishop's hat, and he would carry a shepherd's staff. And basically the shepherd's staff would be used to choose which kids were naughty and like punish them, I guess. And he was known to ride a white horse. He carries a red book with records of the kids' deeds, right? This is like all like Santa shit. And this is also where the Christmas stocking comes from, because I mentioned that in the story, Nicholas threw coins through these impoverished sisters' windows. And so at this time, people were hanging stockings or shoes in their windows so that they could catch the coins that St. Nicholas would throw through the windows. And that brings us to St. Nicholas's motherfucking assistant. I have to bring this up because it's fucking crazy, controversial, and so out of line, and it has to be addressed. St. Nicholas had a fucking assistant known as Zwarte-Piet, I don't know, whatever. This translates to Black Pete. This is real life, and it's still practiced in some parts of Europe, not as much anymore, because I think a lot of parts of the Netherlands have been scrutinized for being racist as fuck. But basically, a guy would dress as a quote-unquote Moor, and they would literally go in blackface. Like, we're talking full-on blackface. If you've seen Atlanta, the Europe season, they show this. This is real shit. So basically, Black Pete is a man in blackface, and he wear a little frilly collar, and he would carry a bag with candy and just throw candy at kids. Sometimes he was like seen carrying a chimney broom, which he would use to spank naughty children. And some songs and stories of the Netherlands describe Black Pete putting naughty children in a bag and sending them to Spain. That's fucked up. Some historians believe that this lore comes from older legends of when the Moors had colonized Spain. And they did, in fact, go to parts of Northern Europe as far as Scandinavia and would enslave people. So that's where it's thought that this myth comes from. But it's super fucking fucked up. And nowadays, Black Pete is not as common to see out in public, but it's a real shit. You should Google it. Fucking Sinterklaas and Black Pete. It's fucked up. So basically, like, the violent qualities of Black Pete are thought to be kind of like a hand-in-hand progression of the Krampus myth. This idea of like punishing naughty children, and like also like using like quote-unquote like heathen and pagan symbology is thought to like be a big reason why Krampus also kind of like grew in popularity. It's this idea of like some kids get rewarded, some kids get punished. Oh, there's a cat meowing outside. Okay, so now, as time is going on, this is kind of, before Santa was even a real thing, like Sinterklaas is like really what was like driving this idea of like this pious man giving out gifts to kids. But at this point, this was celebrated on December 6th because that was the day of Saint Nick. So in Northern Europe, kids were getting gifts on December 6th. And it was actually Martin Luther who decided to change that to giving kids gifts on Christmas Day, because that's when he believed kids deserved gifts. It's similar to like the whole Reformation and Protestant thing, the idea of like giving kids gifts because it was the day Christ was born. It all kind of fits nicely into the picture. Then, as like Charles Dickens became popular, people started making Christmas cards. That's when this idea of Father Christmas emerged in England. And he was drawn as a large man with a long white beard. He would often wear green robes or scarlet robes lined with fur. And he would bring good cheer, peace, food, and wine. And like I was mentioning, St. Nicholas and the veneration of Saints' Day was happening on December 6th. And As time was going on, December 6th became a less and less popular day. People weren't really celebrating it as much. They weren't really feasting. And so that's kind of when all over Europe, people started combining the 2 days of Saints' Day and Christmas Day. And that's kind of how St. Nicholas became grandfathered into Christmas, because originally his day was December 6th. Now we're celebrating his day on the 25th. That's how we get St. Nicholas kind of combining himself with the idea of Father Christmas. And it was really Charles Dickens, as I mentioned, who brought Father Christmas onto the main stage. The ghost of Christmas present in the play/book is depicted as Father Christmas. We have the long white beard, we have the robes. Now we have people writing poems about Christmas. And of course, we have the classic Night Before Christmas, which was written in 1823. And this depicted Father Christmas/Saint Nick as a chubby, plump man with a round belly. And this is where we get the idea of him having reindeer. Reindeer was also a really big part of Scandinavian cultures, just saying. Then moving on to 1845, we have this whole Kris Kringle shit, which became a popular variant in the United States specifically with German immigrants. Kids would hang up stockings so that they could get gifts in them, but this really comes from the Saint Nicholas myth. This could also really be derivative of Sinterklaas, because Sinterklaas means Saint Nick, really, but Claus kind of ties into this whole Kris Kringle, KK alliteration situation. But basically, as time is going on, one of the really big things that cemented Santa in the zeitgeist was a German-American cartoonist who depicted Santa in a newspaper wearing an American flag. That was done in the 1920s, and then soon after, in the 1930s, that's when we have the Coca-Cola company branding Santa as a way to sell Coca-Cola. And this is really just cementing the vision and the image of Santa in the zeitgeist. And so, of course, as Coca-Cola is red and white, Coca-Cola used Santa in their marketing campaign for Christmas to sell more Coca-Cola. Interestingly, a lot of people think that they invented Santa. They didn't. But our image of Santa is actually really based on the drawings of Santa for Coca-Cola. That is true. That image of Santa on the Coca-Cola bottles is really what we think of Santa today. And before that time, it was a little bit more ambiguous. Funnily enough, Pepsi and other brands, other seltzer brands and soda brands, tried to also use Santa to sell their beverages, but obviously it didn't work as much. Coca-Cola really took the cake on that one. Yeah, I read an interesting article that I want to mention, because I kind of think of Santa as problematic, mostly because I think Christmas is now a consumer holiday where we just all think we deserve to spend money and get gifts and blah, blah, blah. But I read an article that brought up an interesting point, that Santa is one of the only major white male role models or figures in pop culture who doesn't carry a gun or a weapon, and he doesn't inflict violence. Yeah, I thought that was actually a really interesting point, because I can't actually think of another white figure in pop culture who doesn't carry a weapon. But I also am laughing because nowadays all of the newer Christmas movies have violent Santas, which I love. I love that the United States just perverts everything. But I just thought that was an interesting thing to mention. But ultimately, still to this day, Puritans still condemn Christmas, as they feel that it has nothing to do with the scriptures, and they feel it is fully materialistic. I have to agree, but I don't necessarily think it's evil. I just think that the idea of supporting major corporations is really problematic. I think there's ways to do Christmas that would just be a nice way to gather with friends and family and eat and enjoy each other. But if you're putting money into the pockets of these giant corporations, maybe that is problematic. Interestingly, also in the Soviet Union, they banned Christmas after the Soviet Union began, starting in 1917. And more recently, in Langfang, which is, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, which is in Hebei province in China. In 2018, they actually released a statement saying that people could be punished for buying or selling Christmas trees, wreaths, stockings, or figures of Santa. And I just find it truly curious that Santa and Christmas is thought of and seen as a time of charity and gift giving, and almost all of the companies in the United States that profit from the toy industry and from gifts are often like monopolies who don't actually give charity and who don't actually give gifts and engage in business practices that exploit human life. So I find it interesting. I find it curious and something to think about, because overall the concepts of Christmas are heartwarming, but it seems truly to be a season of commerce and corporate greed. Sorry to be a hater, but I do really think like the core traditions of the solstice are incredible, like celebrating the end of a cycle, the beginning of a new cycle, the birth of the sun, the birth of fertility, the birth of a new year, using rituals and blood magic and feast, dancing, music, lights, sex, intoxication, naughtiness. Like all of this was once a solstice festival, truly. And I actually love the sentiments of that. And I would love to get back to that, because it's kind of perverse and bizarre that now, like, really, we've boiled Christmas down to a day where we lie to children about a white man who is based off of a war god, but he now like rides in a sleigh with reindeer and gives them gifts. Like, what the fuck? And like adults are like spending their entire paychecks going to the grocery store and buying turkeys and butter and making cookies and farmed Christmas trees that you throw away after. Like, it's curious. It truly is curious. And this whole episode started with the birth of a Palestinian boy as a refugee in Bethlehem. And I just really want that to be the sentiment that you think about after all of this, that there are babies being born as refugees right now in Gaza and in the West Bank. And it's not unlike the baby Yeshua himself. It's pretty fucking crazy. History is repeating itself, and it truly is mind-blowing. It truly is devastating. It truly is tragically ironic. And I hope that regardless of what you celebrate, that we can all choose generosity. I like generosity. Generosity is fantastic. No human is self-made and self-built. We all depend on other humans to care for us. And you can argue with me, but every baby is born helpless. Not a single person alive has done this alone. We depend on human generosity for us to progress as a species. And I really want that to land. There are so many elements of Christmas that come from a very ancient and tribal existence, where the winter time was seen as a time to call in a new year, to celebrate the people who are no longer with us, and to celebrate the birth of a new year. And there is something in that that is incredibly archetypal, beautiful, gorgeous. And with that, that is my very long nutshell of what the fuck is Christmas. Thank you so much for listening to my episode. Please consider supporting me through Patreon. Please consider buying yourself an Esoterica and Nonsense shirt. I'm going to be posting bonus content on my Patreon. I'm going to be doing guided meditations. If you get a chance, listen to my guided meditation episode for a little preview. I hope that you're taking good care of yourself. I hope that you are safe. I hope that no matter what, you choose kindness, you choose love, because otherwise we'll just be living in a world where we're just fucking shooting each other in the face. Am I right? And with that, I will let you go. I hope you have a beautiful day, a beautiful morning, a beautiful night. Over and out.